He hadn't been home in 7 years. 7 years of deals, flights, building a life most people only dream of. And every single month he sent money back home, enough to pay off the house, enough to give his mother a comfortable life. But when he finally came back, the house was empty. The doors were locked, and across the street, someone was watching him. What he discovered next was something no son is ever prepared for. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For 7 years, James Carter lived a life measured in time zones, contracts, and quiet hotel rooms that all looked the same after a while. He had left a small town in Ohio with one clear promise to himself, that he would never return empty-handed, and that the woman who raised him would never struggle another day in her life. Every month, without fail, he wired money back home. Sometimes it was more than she asked for. Sometimes it was everything he could spare after long weeks of work that stretched into sleepless nights. He never questioned it. To him, it was simple. A son takes care of his mother. That was the rule he lived by, the one thing that kept him grounded while everything else in his life moved too fast to fully understand. Grace Carter had always been the kind of woman people respected without needing to say much. She worked long shifts for years, kept to herself, and carried a quiet strength that didn't demand attention but earned it anyway. When Daniel was younger, he remembered nights where she came home late, exhausted but still asking him about his day as if nothing else mattered. She never complained about the bills, never talked about how tight things were, and never let him feel the weight she carried alone. So when Daniel finally left town to build something bigger, it wasn't just ambition driving him. It was repayment. Every dollar he sent was a small attempt to return what she had given him, even though he knew deep down it would never be enough. At first, everything felt normal. Their calls were regular, her voice steady, always reassuring. She would tell him the house was fine, that she had everything she needed, that he should focus on his work and not worry about her. And he believed her. Why wouldn't he? The mortgage was paid off within 2 years. He even sent extra to renovate the place, new furniture, repairs, anything she might need. She thanked him, always in the same calm tone, never asking for more, never sounding overly excited either. Looking back, that should have meant something. But at the time, Daniel saw it as humility. That was just who she was, someone who didn't ask for much, someone who never wanted to be a burden. As the years passed, the calls began to change in ways that were easy to overlook. They became shorter, less detailed, more routine than connection. Sometimes she would answer quickly, other times hours would pass before she returned his call. There were moments when he suggested video calls, wanting to see her, wanting to feel a little closer despite the distance. But she would always find a reason to avoid it. She wasn't feeling well, the house was a mess, the connection wasn't working properly. Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own, but together, they formed something he chose not to examine too closely. Because questioning it meant opening the door to something he wasn't ready to face. There were also the smaller things, details that didn't seem important at the time but stood out clearly now. Neighbors he used to hear about in passing were no longer mentioned. Familiar names disappeared from their conversations. When he asked about the neighborhood, her answers became vague, almost dismissive. She would say things were quiet, that nothing much had changed, that everything was fine. It was always that word, fine, a word that closed the conversation instead of opening it. A word that made it easy for him to move on, without asking more questions. As the 7th year approached, something shifted in a way that was harder to ignore. There were days when she didn't answer at all. Messages went unreturned longer than before. When she finally did call back, her explanations were brief, almost rushed, as if she was trying to end the conversation before it had fully begun. James noticed it, but he justified it the same way he always had. She was getting older. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she just didn't want to worry him. And so he accepted it, because accepting it was easier than confronting what it might mean. Looking back, there was a quiet accumulation of signs. each one small enough to dismiss on its own but together forming a pattern that told a very different story. The unanswered calls, the shorter conversations, the absence of details that once came naturally. And through it all, the money continued to flow, steady and unquestioned, reinforcing the belief that everything was under control, that he was doing what he was supposed to do. But standing there now, faced with the reality that none of it had led where he thought it would, a different thought began to take shape, one that cut deeper than any question about money or distance. Because for all the effort, all the discipline, all the years spent building something he believed would protect her, there was one idea he had never truly challenged. A man provides. That's what he had always believed. That's what had driven every decision he made. But what if providing wasn't enough? The decision to come back hadn't been complicated. In fact, it felt long overdue. After years of movement, constant work, and a life that rarely slowed down, James Carter finally allowed himself to pause. There was no deal waiting, no urgent call pulling him in another direction. For the first time in a long while, he had the space to do something he had been putting off, something that had quietly stayed at the back of his mind through every success and every milestone. He was going home. He didn't tell Grace Carter he was coming. Part of him wanted the moment to be natural, unplanned, something real. He imagined the look on her face when she saw him standing at the door, the kind of moment that didn't need words to mean something. The drive from the airport felt shorter than he remembered, but not because the distance had changed. It was the feeling that came with it, a mix of anticipation and something else he couldn't quite place. The streets were familiar, but there was a distance in how he saw them now, like looking at a place that belonged to a different version of his life. When the taxi finally slowed and turned onto his old street, everything seemed quieter than it should have been. Not empty, just still in a way that made every small detail stand out more than usual. When the car came to a stop in front of the house, James didn't move right away. He looked at it through the window first, taking in what should have felt familiar. The structure was the same, but something about it felt off. The curtains were different, or maybe they were gone entirely. The small details he remembered, the ones that made the place feel lived in, were missing. He stepped out slowly, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing more than it should have in the quiet street. The taxi pulled away without much notice, leaving him standing there alone, facing a place that didn't feel the way it was supposed to. He walked toward the front door with a steady pace, though each step felt heavier than the last. There were no lights on inside, no movement behind the windows, nothing that suggested someone was home. That in itself wasn't unusual, at least not enough to cause concern. Maybe she had stepped out. Maybe she was visiting someone nearby. He reached the door and paused for a moment, his hand hovering just before knocking, as if giving himself a second to settle whatever feeling had begun to form in his chest. When he finally knocked, the sound felt louder than expected. It carried into the silence and disappeared without any response. He waited, listening carefully, expecting to hear footsteps, the shift of movement from inside something. But there was nothing. He knocked again, this time firmer, more certain. Still nothing. The absence of sound began to take on a weight of its own, turning a simple moment into something harder to explain. James reached for the handle, expecting it to give, expecting the door to open the way it always had before. But it didn't. It was locked. He tried again, slower this time, as if the result might change if he approached it differently. It didn't. The door remained closed, unyielding, separating him from a space that no longer felt like his to enter. He stepped back slightly, looking at the house again, this time with more attention, more focus, as if searching for something he might have missed at first glance. The longer he stood there, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a matter of timing or coincidence. There was a stillness to the place that didn't feel temporary. It felt settled, like something had already been decided long before he arrived. And in that moment, the thought he had been pushing aside since he stepped onto the street returned with more certainty than before. Something wasn't right. It was then that he became aware of the feeling of being watched. Not in a way that was immediate or obvious, but something that settled in gradually, pulling his attention away from the house and toward the street around him. Across the road, a figure stood near the edge of a driveway, still and observant. A woman older, her posture steady, her gaze fixed directly on him. She hadn't just noticed his arrival. She had been watching, as if she knew exactly why he was there and what he would find. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them felt longer than it actually was, filled with something unspoken. James turned fully to face her, the questions already forming before he even took a step in her direction. Because by then, it was clear that whatever answers he was about to get would not come from the house behind him. They would come from somewhere else, somewhere he had never expected to look. The woman didn't rush her words, and that alone told James Carter more than anything she could have said right away. There was a pause, a careful look in her eyes, as if she was measuring how much he was ready to hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something behind it, something that suggested this wasn't new to her, that she had seen this moment coming long before he arrived. She told him his mother wasn't there anymore, and when he asked where she had gone, she didn't answer with an explanation, only a direction. A quiet gesture down the street, toward a part of town that felt removed from everything he remembered. James didn't hesitate for long. Whatever uncertainty he had was replaced by something stronger, something that pushed him forward without needing to think it through. The woman walked ahead of him at a measured pace, not looking back, as if she assumed he would follow. And he did. The further they moved from the house, the more the surroundings began to change. The streets lost their familiarity, the houses giving way to older structures that showed clear signs of time and neglect. It wasn't the kind of place people chose to be. It was the kind of place they ended up when there were no other options left. There was a quietness to the area that felt different from the street he had just left. Not peaceful, but empty in a way that carried weight. Windows were broken or covered, doors worn down, small details that spoke of time passing without care. James noticed all of it, even if he didn't fully process what it meant yet. His focus was ahead, on the path the woman was leading him down, on the growing sense that each step was taking him further from the life he thought he had built for his mother, and closer to something he didn't yet understand. When they finally stopped, it was in front of a structure that stood apart even in a place like this. It looked abandoned or at least forgotten. The exterior was worn, the windows partially broken, the door slightly off its frame. The woman didn't say anything this time. She simply looked at him once briefly, before turning and walking away, leaving him alone with what stood in front of him. That silence felt intentional, as if whatever came next was something he had to face on his own. James stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the building, his mind trying to reject what was right in front of him. This couldn't be where she was. It didn't make sense. Not after everything. Not after all the years, all the money, all the effort to make sure she would never have to live like this again. And yet, something inside him already knew. It was the same feeling that had followed him from the moment he stepped onto the street. The same quiet certainty that things were not what they were supposed to be. He moved forward slowly, each step deliberate, as if the pace itself could delay whatever truth waited inside. The door gave way with little resistance when he pushed it, opening into a space that felt colder than it should have been. The air inside was still, carrying a sense of emptiness that made every small movement stand out. For a brief second, he hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing it would confirm everything he wasn't ready to accept. But then he stepped inside. At first, it was difficult to make sense of what he was seeing. The space was bare, stripped down to only what was necessary. There were signs of someone living there, but just barely. A small area set up for rest, a few belongings placed carefully, as if arranged with intention despite the conditions. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't neglect in the way he expected, it was something else entirely. Controlled, quiet, minimal in a way that felt chosen, even if the setting clearly was. And then he saw her. Grace Carter sat near the far side of the room, her posture straight despite the environment around her. She looked smaller than he remembered, thinner, the years showing in ways he hadn't noticed through phone calls and distant conversations. But her expression was the same. calm, composed, as if this place, this situation didn't disturb her in the way it did him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them felt greater than the space itself, filled with everything that hadn't been said over the past 7 years. James took a step forward, then another, his eyes never leaving her, searching for something that would explain what he was seeing. Something that would tell him this wasn't real, that there was a reason, a simple explanation that would bring everything back into place. But the more he looked, the more it became clear that this was real. This was where she had been. This was how she had been living. "Mama, what is this?" The words came out quieter than he expected, carrying more weight than he intended. They hung in the space between them, unanswered for just a moment too long. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady in a way that didn't match the situation. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm, as if what she was about to say had been settled long before he ever walked through that door. Grace Carter didn't look away when James asked the question. She held his gaze in a way that felt steady, almost reassuring, as if she understood the weight behind his words but didn't share the same urgency to answer them. For a moment, it seemed like she was choosing her response carefully, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she already knew how it would land. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm tone he had heard on every phone call, the same tone that had convinced him everything was fine. "It's just a place to stay," she said. The simplicity of the answer didn't match the reality around them. James looked around again, as if seeing it a second time might make more sense, but it didn't. Nothing about this felt temporary, and nothing about it felt like something she had been forced into without reason. That was the part that unsettled him the most. There was no panic in her, no sign that she saw this as a problem that needed fixing. It was as if she had already accepted it, long before he even knew it existed. He stepped closer, his voice firmer now, carrying the confusion and disbelief he could no longer hold back. He asked about the house, about the money, about everything he had sent over the years. Each question came out sharper than the last, not out of anger, but out of the need to understand how things had ended up here. And for the first time, Grace's expression shifted, not into distress, but into something more reflective, as if she had expected this moment and had been waiting for it to arrive. "The house is gone," she said quietly. "It was paid off just like you wanted, but there were other things that needed to be taken care of." James felt the words settle in slowly, not fully registering at first. Other things. It was too vague, too open, and yet it carried more meaning than she was saying outright. He pressed further, asking what she meant, asking where the money had gone if not toward her own comfort, toward the life he believed he was building for her. And this time when she answered, there was no hesitation. There had been debts, not hers alone, but connected to people she felt responsible for. Old obligations that had followed others for years, situations she had stepped into quietly without telling him. There were neighbors who had fallen behind, families who needed help, people she couldn't turn away from when she had the means to do something about it. And then there were donations, small at first, then more frequent, given to places and people she believed needed it more than she did. Each decision made sense to her in the moment, each one justified by the same reasoning she had lived by her entire life. If she could help, she would. James listened, but the explanation only deepened the weight in his chest. It wasn't just the money. It was the realization that everything he thought he understood about the situation had been incomplete. He had been sending money with one intention, believing it would create stability for her, believing it would give her the life she had earned. But she had been using it differently, shaping it into something else entirely, something that never included herself the way he had imagined. "You needed that life more than I did," Grace said, her voice still calm, still certain. "I didn't want to be the reason you stopped." The words landed harder than anything else she had said. Because in that moment, James understood something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. She hadn't told him the truth because she didn't want to interrupt what he was building. She had protected his progress the same way she had protected him growing up quietly, without drawing attention to what it cost her. Every short call, every avoided conversation, every moment he thought she was simply being independent, it had all been part of the same choice. She had decided that his future mattered more than her present. And standing there, surrounded by the reality of that choice, James felt a shift that went beyond confusion or frustration. It was something deeper, something harder to face. Because for all the years he believed he was doing the right thing, for all the effort he put into providing, there was one part of it he had overlooked. He had been present in numbers, in transfers, in the idea of support. But he hadn't been there, not in the way that mattered most. And now, looking at what his absence had allowed to happen, that realization carried a weight no amount of success could balance. For a long moment after Grace Carter finished speaking, there was nothing left for James Carter to say. The questions that had driven him there, the confusion, the urgency to understand, all of it seemed to settle into something quieter, something heavier. Because now he knew, not just what had happened to the money or why she was living the way she was, but what it had cost for things to unfold like this. And that cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in time, in absence, in all the moments that never happened because he believed providing from a distance was enough. The next steps came without discussion, without hesitation. James didn't argue with her, didn't try to convince her she was wrong. Instead, he focused on what needed to change. He arranged for her to leave that place, to move somewhere safe, somewhere that reflected the life he had always intended for her. It wasn't complicated for him to make it happen. The resources were there, the means had never been the problem. But as he helped her gather the few things she had kept, as he looked at how little she had allowed herself to hold on to, it became clear that fixing the situation wasn't the same as undoing it. Grace didn't resist. She didn't question his decisions or push back against the changes he was making. She accepted it the same way she had accepted everything else, quietly, without making it about herself. And that, more than anything, stayed with him. Because even now, even after everything had been revealed, she wasn't asking for anything more. She wasn't holding on to what she had given up, wasn't trying to make him feel responsible in a direct way. But the weight of it was there anyway, carried not in her words, but in everything he now understood. In the days that followed, James did what he had always done. He provided. He made sure she had comfort, stability, a place that felt like home again. On the surface, it looked like things had been corrected, like the situation had been resolved in the way it was supposed to be. But underneath that, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be restored so easily. Because what had been missing all those years wasn't just security. It was presence. It was time. It was the kind of connection that couldn't be replaced by effort sent from far away. For James, the realization didn't come all at once. It settled in gradually, through small moments, through conversations that now felt different, through the awareness of how much had gone unnoticed for so long. He had built a life defined by achievement, by discipline, by the ability to create something out of nothing. And in doing so, he believed he was fulfilling the role he had set for himself. A man provides. That belief had guided him through everything. But now, standing on the other side of it, he saw the limitation of that idea. Because providing on its own had not been enough. It had solved problems, yes. It had created opportunities, removed burdens, changed circumstances. But it hadn't replaced being there. It hadn't filled the space that only presence could fill. And in that absence, decisions had been made, sacrifices had been carried, and a reality had taken shape that he had never intended. Grace, in her own way, had protected him from that truth for as long as she could. She had allowed him to move forward without interruption, to build without distraction, to believe that everything back home was exactly as it should be. And in doing so, she had continued the same pattern she had lived by his entire life, putting his future ahead of her own needs. It was a choice made out of love, but it was still a choice that came with consequences. In the end, there was no dramatic resolution, no single moment that erased what had happened. There was only understanding, the kind that comes too late to change the past, but just in time to shape what comes next. And for James Carter, that understanding carried a truth he would not forget. After everything he built, the one thing that mattered most was the one thing he wasn't there for. Stories like this don't end the way most people expect them to. There's no clean line where everything is fixed and left behind. Instead, what remains are the questions, the kind that stay with you long after the moment has passed. Because when you look at James Carter's story closely, it isn't just about money or distance or even sacrifice. It's about choices. The kind of choices that seem right at the time, the kind that feel responsible, necessary, even honorable. And yet, when everything is revealed, they leave you wondering if there was another way. So now the question turns to you. What would you have done in his position? If you were given the same opportunity, the same responsibility, would you have made the same decisions? Would you have stayed focused on building something bigger, believing that providing from a distance was enough? Or would you have done things differently, even if it meant risking the future you were trying so hard to create? Because the truth is, there isn't a simple answer. What looks right from one side can feel incomplete from another. And then there's the question that sits at the center of it all. Do you think he failed, or did he do his best? It's easy to judge the outcome when you see where it led, but it's harder to place yourself in the middle of it in the years where the signs were small, where the decisions felt justified, where the belief that everything was under control made it easier to keep moving forward. James Carter didn't walk away. He didn't stop caring. He did what he believed was right. But now, with everything laid out in front of him, that belief carries a different weight. Maybe that's what makes this story stay with people. Not because it's extreme, but because it's familiar in ways that are easy to overlook. The balance between success and responsibility. The line between providing and being present. The quiet assumption that doing more is always the answer, even when what matters most might require something entirely different. And if you think this story is unbelievable, the next one is even more shocking.